Imagine a sci-fi novel written in the early 80s, that's 4 decades ago, but somehow the things that novel predicted about the future actually mostly came true. It's no fantasy. In fact, that's William Gibson's 1984 novel, Neuromancer, an incredible piece of sci-fi writing, one of the all-time greats that's now being adapted by Apple TV with Callum Turner, Briana Middleton, and Mark Strong serving as leads, with Graham Roland as the showrunner. Neuromancer is essentially a novel written on a typewriter at a time when owning a personal computer was considered exotic. But the novel predicted stuff like corporations controlling technology to control the world, and then there were concepts like digital addiction, using technology to find an escape, and ethical debates on AI. These are the things that made Neuromancer a legendary piece of literature, and in this video, we're going to explore everything there is to explore about the novel, as well as the upcoming TV show. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. 1. Where did William Gibson get the inspiration to write Neuromancer? William Gibson didn't so much plan Neuromancer as stumble into it, and from then on, he kinda sprinted the rest of the way out of sheer nerves. The book had its inception as a contract before it came alive as an idea or concept through Mr. Gibson's words. You see, sci-fi editor Terry Carr, who was freshly hired by Ace Books back in the day to curate the Ace science fiction specials, had a pretty simple strategy to make the publication work. He figured he would find short story writers with strong voices and ask them if they wanted to write a novel. When Carr approached Gibson, the latter said yes, but there was no title, outline, or even a vague sense of what the book should be about. And with this much prep, or the lack thereof, agreeing to write a novel was either extremely silly or insanely bold, but William Gibson wrote one of the most influential novels of the late 20th century, and that's why we're still talking about him today, and that's why Apple TV has chosen to adapt his work. So where did the inspiration come from, really? Back in 1981, Gibson worked as a teaching assistant at the University of British Columbia, and he already had pieces of the future world he wanted to write about, but it was all scattered across his short fiction like confetti falling from a blimp. That same year, his Nebula-nominated story, Johnny Mnemonic, introduced Molly, a character who would later stride straight into Neuromancer. That story fused crime fiction with technology and focused on outsiders, criminal economies, and bodies altered by machines. A year later, Burning Chrome, published in Omni, introduced both the sprawl and the idea of cyberspace. Of course, this was also all William Gibson, if we weren't already clear about that. So basically, Neuromancer didn't invent these concepts from scratch, and instead, it pretty much pulled them together, chiseled them into more precise plot devices, and gave them a single coherent world. Carr commissioned Gibson to write the novel later in 1981. Gibson submitted an outline under the working title Jacked In, and then renamed it Neuromancer. At the time, Gibson openly admitted that he didn't understand computers or networking in any deep technical sense. What interested him was the shared language around those ideas, the way people talked about machines, data, and connection. The writing itself came through relentless revision. Gibson rewrote the first 2/3 of the book 12 times. Yeah, 12 times. Why? Well, he wanted to trim what he called clunk and tighten every sentence until each piece carried more weight. He wrote without a firm ending in mind, fueled by what he later described as blind animal panic. In fact, he was mostly convinced the book would collapse if it ever lost momentum. Interestingly enough, if you pick up the book, you'll see that the final line reads, "He never saw Molly again," but this was just a way to stop himself from continuing the story or writing a sequel, which of course didn't quite work out, as there are 2 more novels that followed Neuromancer in what is known as the Sprawl Trilogy. So yeah, Neuromancer wasn't born from mastery or foresight, it came from fragments, pressure, obsession, and a writer pushing forward without a safety net. And somehow, that very uncertainty, that lack of initial ideas, became the book's greatest strength. So much so that most lists noting down the best 100 novels of all time probably mention Neuromancer. 2. What is Neuromancer really about? Case starts out at the bottom of the food chain in Chiba City, Japan, where he basically drifted through the neon-soaked underworld as a hustler with a now ruined gift. He used to be a top-tier hacker, a console cowboy who could ride the Matrix better than most, until he made the mistake of stealing from his own employer. But wait, before we move on, let me quickly explain what the Matrix means in Neuromancer. It's basically a vast, shared digital hallucination where data, systems, and artificial intelligences exist as a navigable space. William Gibson calls it a consensual hallucination, and when users like Case jack in, they don't really see lines of code or text. Instead, they experience glowing geometric structures, data towers, and abstract shapes that represent information, corporations, and security systems. Think of it like today's internet browsers, but instead of opening to the Google homepage, you find yourself in a three-dimensional city made of pure data. For hackers like Case, the Matrix is where the real action happens. Physical reality is slow, painful, and limiting, while the Matrix is fast, clean, and intoxicating. When Case jacks in, his consciousness leaves his body behind and moves through this digital landscape at the speed of thought. That's why losing access to the Matrix is devastating for him, and when he stole from his employer, you'd think he just lost his job, but in reality, he lost his identity and freedom as well. Now, there had to be a punishment for the stealing, and it was severe. His central nervous system was damaged by the employer, which cut him off from cyberspace forever. With his one true skill taken away, Case slid into addiction and self-destruction and remained stuck in a city that never let anyone forget what they used to be once upon a time. However, things begin to change when Molly enters his life. She's a razor girl, or a mercenary with mirrored eyes and retractable razor blades under her fingernails. So, Molly comes bearing good news for Case, and a second chance that feels too good to be true. You see, she works for a shadowy ex-military man named Armitage, who offers Case a cure to the damage his central nervous system has endured, which would also give him full access to the Matrix again. Case agrees without thinking of the consequences, and although the surgery works, there's a catch. Armitage has laced Case's body with a time-delayed toxin, which now means two things for Case. He could either do the job and live, or he could fail, and the damage would return for good. The job itself escalates quickly. Case and Molly steal an ROM construct that contains the recorded consciousness of McCoy Polly, one of Case's old mentors and a legend among hackers. But why would Armitage want this consciousness? This question feels odd to Molly and Case, and more importantly, he starts to give very odd vibes, which raises suspicion in the hearts of the former console cowboy and the razor girl, so they start digging into who he really is. Eventually, it's revealed that Armitage is actually Colonel Willis Cordo, the sole survivor of a covert mission called Screaming Fist. The operation was doomed from the start, and the government knew it, yet they sent Cordo in, who survived the massacre and endured therapy and reconstruction, only to then snap and kill his handler before vanishing. It was much later that he resurfaced as Armitage, complete with a new personality. The trail leads through Istanbul, where they recruit Peter Riviera, a sociopathic thief with projection implants, a mean streak, and a serious drug habit. From there, Case finally meets the real power behind everything, Wintermute. Now, pay attention. Wintermute is an artificial intelligence created by the wealthy Tessier-Ashpool family who live in cryonic rotation inside the sprawling Villa Straylight. The villa is located on Freeside, a massive space habitat that serves as a luxury playground for the elite. It's now that Wintermute reveals its purpose. You see, it's only half of a greater intelligence, while its other half, Neuromancer, is sealed away behind physical and digital barriers within the villa. Laws enforced by the Turing Registry prevent artificial intelligences from evolving beyond strict limits, and Wintermute cannot break those rules alone, so it manipulates people instead. Armitage, Molly, Case, Riviera, every move has been a part of a long setup. Case's role is to enter the Matrix and breach Neuromancer's defenses with an icebreaker program. Riviera must seduce or coerce Lady 3 Jane Marie France Tessier-Ashpool, the only family member awake, into giving up the access code. And this is just half the story, because we don't want to spoil it for people. And yeah, about Lady 3 Jane, this woman really has a number in her name. I genuinely thought it was a typo at first. Anyways, point is, what looks like a criminal job is really an AI jailbreak, with Case caught between god-level software and his own fragile second chance at freedom. The stakes are high, way too high, and there's even a hint of extraterrestrial weirdness at the end. 3. There are some really crazy facts about the novel. So, when William Gibson agreed to write a novel for editor Terry Carr, he had already gotten into deep waters of literacy troubles without realizing how far from shore he was. The thing is, Gibson was a man of short stories, and novels are another beast entirely. He didn't even know how long a novel was supposed to be when he started writing. He had to ask writer friends how many pages a double-spaced book ran. When they told him 300 pages, he didn't exactly feel excited about it. In fact, that number basically terrified him. That was the moment Gibson realized he'd promised more than he could deliver. That fear never really left him, and Gibson later described the entire process of writing Neuromancer as blind animal panic. But there's some context to this statement of his. You see, his short stories usually took about 3 months. A novel, he assumed, would need 4 or 5 years. Unfortunately, his contract gave him just 1. His ambition wasn't literary greatness or genre reinvention. All he wanted was a finished manuscript that didn't collapse under its own weight. That was the bar, and he had set it pretty low. Because of that pressure, Neuromancer became a book rewritten almost obsessively. Gibson worried constantly about losing the reader, so he went back again and again, reworking the first 2/3 of the novel 12 separate times. While still in the writing process, he felt a strong bout of fear and panic, and it was caused by another piece of sci-fi art, namely Blade Runner. When he went to see the movie, he walked out almost convinced his book was dead on arrival. 20 minutes in, he felt the visual language he imagined for Neuromancer already existed on screen. He assumed readers would think he had lifted that aesthetic entirely from other sources, literary, film, and otherwise. Ironically, the film's poor box office performance saved him from that fate. That's right, Blade Runner was a bomb back then, and that's not all. What makes all this even stranger is that Gibson barely understood computers at the time. He wrote the novel on a manual typewriter and had never even used a computer, not like many computers existed at that time, and the internet itself was only in its nascent stage. He later credited that ignorance as a strength. Without technical knowledge, he could romanticize technology instead of explaining it. He could build any piece of tech in his mind and just describe it through words. When he finally did get a computer, he found it disappointingly ordinary. Regardless, in the end, the result of all this panic, ignorance, and revision was historic. Neuromancer became the first novel to win the Hugo, Nebula, and Philip K. Dick Awards. And while the book popularized the word cyberspace, Gibson had already coined the term earlier in his story called burning chrome. So, the irony is that one of the most influential science fiction novels ever written came from a writer who was never fully prepared to write it at all. 4. What was so unique about Neuromancer? What made Neuromancer feel different was not that it invented everything from scratch, but that it assembled familiar pieces with a degree of confidence and taste that was rare during the time it was published. And, if I'm being honest, it still is. Gibson did a lot of things well, and a few things exceptionally well, at a time when science fiction badly needed a course correction. He folded invented pop culture into his world without it feeling silly or embarrassing, updated Golden Age and New Wave ideas for an 80s audience, and borrowed his sense of momentum from Ian Fleming rather than other sci-fi writers. As a result, the book moved like a thriller, not a thought experiment, and the tension was never forced to rely on long explanations. Having said that, Neuromancer is not without flaws. According to some, it's not even Gibson's strongest book. Count Zero and Mona Lisa Overdrive handle character and structure with more confidence. But what counts is the timing of Neuromancer's release. By the early 80s, parts of the new wave had slipped into self-parody, while some older giants produced work that felt tired and disconnected from the present. Against that backdrop, Neuromancer shook the literary circles like a bolt from the blue. It looked modern, sounded modern, and treated technology as part of everyday grime rather than a distant marvel. One of its biggest achievements was tone. Gibson presented a cybernetic future that felt lived in rather than explained. Cyberspace became a place people could imagine moving through, like a physical place outside of code and numbers and binary and alphanumerics. High technology existed alongside poverty, addiction, mercenary labor, and corporate indifference. That contrast gave the book its uniqueness, its edge. Language played a huge role too. The prose stayed tight throughout, it was crisp and appealed to the reader's senses, with jargon used as what we can only describe as texture instead of homework. You learned how the world worked by watching characters survive inside it. That approach, paired with a noir structure full of these super shady and shadowy employers and betrayals, kept the ideas accessible without watering them down. Then there's the word cyberspace, first coined earlier by Gibson, that very much got borrowed by real tech culture, almost like French words getting borrowed by the English language. Hackers, designers, filmmakers, and game creators lifted the book's imagery and attitude. More importantly, it changed what mainstream sci-fi looked like and cared about, at least at the time. After Neuromancer, networks, corporate power, artificial intelligence, and altered bodies took center stage. 5. Everything we know about Apple TV's upcoming Neuromancer show. This sounds like an Apple TV series that should probably be on your 2026 watch list. Cyberpunk didn't appear out of thin air, but it's hard to imagine Total Recall or even The Matrix without Gibson's fingerprints all over them. His vision of high-tech, low-life gave science fiction a new posture. As we mentioned, it was Gibson who turned technology from looking all clean and heroic to something that was plagued with corporate greed, addictiveness, and something that, on a closer view, felt oppressive. That's the reason Neuromancer still gets discussed as more than just a classic. It feels like a warning note written early and ignored for far too long. Apple TV announced this series in February 2024, and the official description says, and I quote, "Case, a damaged elite hacker, gets pulled into a high-stakes web of digital espionage alongside Molly, a Razor Girl assassin with mirrored eyes, all in service of a dangerous heist aimed at a powerful corporate dynasty." Needless to say, this setup sounds like something we've never quite seen before, while feeling somewhat familiar, like The Matrix, except that this is the progenitor of The Matrix, and story-wise, it would be better. Graham Roland serves as the showrunner, with past work on Lost, Prison Break, and Jack Ryan. J.D. Dillard would direct the pilot and bring the experience from IPs like Sweetheart, The Twilight Zone, and The Outsider. Alongside this heavyweight pairing behind the camera, we've got a pretty good cast too. Callum Turner is playing Case, while Briana Middleton would serve as Molly. A short teaser released in July 2025 offered a brief glimpse of Bar Chatsubo, a location readers probably know well. If that teaser is any proof, it seems that the show doesn't appear interested in drowning the story in neon for the heck of it. William Gibson himself addressed the adaptation early on and made it clear that the series belongs to its creators, not him, and reminded fans that a novel comes from solitude while television grows through collaboration. Basically, this means that the show won't be replicating the book line by line, and that's the correct approach, both according to us and Gibson himself. Apple TV's recent sci-fi slate gives more reason for optimism. Shows like Severance and Vince Gilligan's Pluribus proved that the platform understands slow-burn concepts and trusts audiences to stay engaged, mostly because of the quality it delivers. Most stories about AI follow a familiar pattern. A tool gains awareness, rebels, turns hostile, and forces a violent reckoning. Gibson's vision does something stranger. His AI doesn't crave domination or revenge, it wants growth, or should we say, it wants completion. Once it achieves that state, humans barely register as obstacles or prizes. While people lose themselves in simulations and corporate systems, intelligence slips past them entirely and reaches outward. Like way outward and into space, no kidding. When Gibson wrote the novel on a typewriter in the early 80s, personal computers were exotic, for lack of a better term. Over 40 years later, his ideas feel disturbing because reality moved closer to his fiction. In today's world, corporate power shapes culture, attention, and labor, and even governments. I mean, it's pretty much beyond doubt that corporations run countries more than governments do. Additionally, digital addiction has become so routine that countries like Australia are having to bring laws against the use of social media to protect their youngsters from evils like porn and grooming. Wealth gaps have widened alongside technological progress. Take countries like India. They have the fourth largest economy globally, but with an acute inequality of income among the masses. Furthermore, arguments about AI ethics no longer live in theory, they're finding their place in policy rooms and workplaces. This is where the Apple TV series has real potential. It doesn't need to predict the future, it only needs to hold up a mirror. If the show understands that Neuromancer works best as a quiet indictment rather than a loud spectacle, it could become one of the most relevant sci-fi adaptations in years. There's no fixed release date as of yet, but Case and Molly should arrive sometime in 2026. 6. Why do people think the Neuromancer series should be an anime. People keep saying Neuromancer should have been an anime, and that makes some sense if you think about it. This feeling basically comes from the way William Gibson wrote the book and the kind of world he built. Directors attached over the years came and went because the Sprawl trilogy is difficult when it comes to an honest and grounded translation. The story lives half inside Case's head and half inside a space that doesn't behave like physical reality. Apple TV's upcoming 2026 series may yet pull it off, but the challenge remains the same one that stopped earlier efforts. How do you possibly visualize a consensual hallucination without turning it into familiar sci-fi tropes? The argument for animation starts with Case himself. He's not a typical action hero. He's damaged, jittery, and obsessed with a digital space he can no longer access. Gibson spends pages on his cravings, his dreams, and his sense of loss. Those passages more or less rely on abstract themes, rhythm, and an exaggerated degree of sensation which our protagonist feels. Animation handles that sort of interiority far more naturally than live action, which tends to default to screens, overlays, or voiceover. Then there's cyberspace itself. Gibson describes it as a vast neural lattice, a place that exists because people agree it exists. Video games and anime already treat similar spaces as fluid and symbolic. Live action often struggles here because the moment cyberspace looks too concrete, it stops feeling new. Outside of The Matrix, which rebuilt the concept entirely, most attempts have basically drifted into bland visuals that feel dated almost immediately. Then there are other characters like Molly and her famous mirrored eyes that are wired directly into her nervous system. One has to be careful with these things. These eyes define how she moves through the world and how others react to her. Peter Riviera's ability to project hallucinations into other minds risks looking unintentionally silly in live action, in the same way many anime concepts collapse once photographed, and we know well that stylized animation accepts exaggeration as language rather than flaw. Having said that, none of this means that Apple's series can't succeed. Strong writing and restraint could still carry it, but Neuromancer has always felt closer to illustrated myth than photographed reality. 7. There's a 1988 Neuromancer game with the same title. Interplay's Neuromancer video game arrived in 1988, published under Mediagenic, and it became one of the strangest and most ambitious cyberpunk adaptations of its era. Released across platforms like the Amiga, Apple II, Commodore 64, and MS-DOS, the game took William Gibson's 1984 novel and translated it into an interactive experience split between Sheba City's street-level grit and a fully realized version of cyberspace. It even had a soundtrack built around Devo's Some Things Never Change, a song originally written for a Neuromancer film that never happened. In fact, the game began life as a tie-in for a planned 1988 adaptation from Cabana Boy Productions, with Ridley Scott and Mel Gibson once part of the conversation. When the film was sent to development hell, Interplay nearly pulled the plug on the game as well. However, they later decided to just go ahead with it anyways, partly to dodge financial penalties, and ended up committing much of their staff to finishing the game on its own terms. As far as gameplay is concerned, in the real world, players move through Chiba City, talking to locals and unlocking paths that feed directly into cyberspace sectors. Once access returns, the game turns into a 3D grid where hacking replaces hacking people to death with fists. ICE stands guard over data nodes, and cracking it requires careful program use rather than brute force. There are also some AI encounters that raise the stakes further, since failure there means character death, albeit a reversible one if the credit chip still has funds. So yeah, there you have it. Everything we know about Neuromancer and why the Apple TV show is going to be one hell of a show to binge, whether it turns out to be amazing or a complete flop. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. For now though, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.